The truck lurched to a stop, its brakes squealing like something wounded. Inside the canvas-covered bed, 23 Italian soldiers swayed against each other, thin shoulders knocking against wooden slats, hands gripping whatever they could find. The air smelled of diesel and fear. Through gaps in the canvas, Marco Bianchi glimpsed unfamiliar terrain sliding past. No mountains, no olive groves, just flat Texas earth stretching to a horizon so wide it felt like drowning in the sky. It was the spring of 1943, and the war that had devoured North Africa was now bleeding these men across an ocean into a country they had been taught to despise. Marco, 24 years old, once a stonemason in a village outside Florence, sat with his back pressed against the truck's metal frame, trying to make himself small. His uniform hung loose on bones that hunger had carved sharper over months of desert combat. Beside him, Giovanni Rossi, a fisherman's son from Sicily who still carried the smell of salt despite everything, stared at his boots with eyes gone flat. The surrender in Tunisia had been swift and humiliating. One moment, Marco's unit had been dug into defensive positions near the coast, praying for reinforcements that never came. The next, American tanks rolled over the horizon like a steel tide. And officers who had once shouted about Roman glory were tearing insignia from their tunics. Marco remembered the heat, the dust, the strange relief of raising his hands. No one had fired. The Americans had simply waved them toward waiting trucks, faces neither cruel nor kind, just tired. They had been told many things. Mussolini's voice on crackling radios had promised that the Americans were mongrels, violent, and without culture. That to be captured was a fate worse than death, a descent into savagery. The propaganda posters showed barbaric cowboys, leering and brutal. Marco had half believed it because belief was easier than terror, yet when the American guards handed out canteens of water on the dock at New York, no one had spat in their faces. When they boarded trains heading inland, the civilians who glanced through windows looked curious, not hateful. Now the truck stopped again. Canvas flaps were pulled back, flooding the interior with blinding sunlight. "Rouse," an American voice called, the accent strange, but the command clear. Marco climbed down stiffly, legs unsteady after days of travel. Around him, other prisoners stumbled into formation, blinking against the brightness. They stood in a long dirt yard ringed by barbed wire fences, watchtowers rising at the corners like silent judges. Beyond the wire, Texas stretched infinite and indifferent. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The camp was called something American that Marco couldn't pronounce. To him, it looked less like a prison than a strange military village. Low wooden barracks lined up in neat rows, a mess hall with smoke curling from its chimney. Off to one side, a building with wide doors propped open, revealing glimpses of polished floors and equipment he couldn't quite identify. Guards moved with casual efficiency, rifles slung but not raised. One young sergeant, freckled and sunburned, handed out blankets without meeting anyone's eyes. Marco felt disorientation settle over him like fog. He had braced himself for chains, for beatings, for the cruelty promised by every broadcast. Instead, there was only routine. They were counted, names checked against lists on clipboards. A medic, an older man with gentle hands, examined Marco's blistered feet without comment and applied a salve that stung but felt like mercy. When someone asked in broken Italian where the latrines were, the guard pointed without sneering. That first night, lying on a thin mattress in a barracks that smelled of new wood and disinfectant, Marco stared at the ceiling and tried to understand. Giovanni whispered from the next bunk, his voice trembling. "They feed us tomorrow." Marco didn't know. He didn't know anything anymore. The world he had been raised to believe in, the certainties drilled into him during training, had begun to crack the moment he stepped off that truck, and the silence around him, broken only by the soft breathing of exhausted men, felt heavier than any bombardment. Dawn came pale and cool. A bell rang somewhere, harsh and metallic, pulling Marco from shallow sleep. Around him, men stirred, groaning as muscles stiff from travel protested movement. They dressed slowly, fumbling with buttons, avoiding each other's eyes. No one spoke of what might come next. Fear lived in the spaces between words. Outside, the morning air carried unfamiliar scents. Dust, yes, but also something green and growing, so different from the desert's barren bite. Guards appeared, motioning the prisoners into lines. The routine felt almost military, almost normal, except for the barbed wire gleaming in the early light. Marco found himself standing between Giovanni and an older man named Antonio, a former shopkeeper from Milan whose hands still moved as if measuring fabric. The march to the mess hall was short. Through the doors, warmth rolled out like an embrace. Long tables filled the room, and at the far end, American cooks moved behind steaming vats. The smell hit Marco first. Bread, real bread, not the sawdust biscuits they'd choked down in Africa. Something savoury and rich that made his stomach clench with sudden, desperate hunger. He hadn't realised how empty he'd become until that scent promised fullness. They shuffled forward, each man handed a metal tray. Marco watched the cook ahead of him ladle thick stew over a mound of rice. Another added bread, soft and pale. A third poured coffee, dark and fragrant, into a tin cup. Marco stared at his tray, unable to process the abundance. Giovanni beside him made a small, choked sound. Antonio's hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped his cup. They sat at benches worn smooth by use. For a moment no one moved. The guards stood at intervals along the walls, watching but not threatening. One caught Marco's eye and gave a slight nod, as if to say, "Eat, permission granted." Marco lifted his spoon. The stew was hot, flavourful, seasoned with care. The bread dissolved on his tongue like a childhood memory. He ate slowly at first, then faster, unable to stop himself. Around him, other men did the same, silent except for the scrape of spoons and the occasional gasp. When his tray was empty, Marco sat back, overwhelmed. His body felt strange, heavy with food it hadn't known in months. Giovanni leaned close and whispered, "This can't be real." The words hung between them. Marco wanted to agree, wanted to cling to suspicion, but his full stomach argued otherwise. The Americans had fed them. Not scraps, not punishment rations, but food that would satisfy a man. It made no sense. Enemies didn't do this. Propaganda had been clear. Yet here he sat, warm and fed, in the enemy's camp. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both alien and oddly comforting. Each morning began with roll call in the yard, guards checking names against lists, counting heads with bureaucratic precision. Then came work assignments. Some men were sent to maintain the camp, repairing fences or cleaning barracks. Others, like Marco, were assigned to a nearby farm under guard, loading hay bales and mending irrigation ditches. The labour was hard but fair. No one shouted, no one struck. At midday, they stopped for lunch, sandwiches and fruit distributed without ceremony. Giovanni worked in the camp kitchen, peeling vegetables alongside American cooks who tried to teach him English words. Table, knife, potato. He repeated them shyly, earning patient corrections and occasional laughter. At night, he returned to the barracks with stories. The cook, a man named Jimmy from someplace called Georgia, had shown him how Americans made cornbread. Another had asked about Sicily, curious and kind. Giovanni didn't know what to make of it. None of them did. Antonio, the former shopkeeper, found himself assigned to the camp laundry. He worked methodically, folding uniforms with the same care he'd once given to bolts of cloth. One afternoon, an American officer stopped by, watching him work. The officer said something in English that Antonio didn't understand, then smiled and left. Later, through the translator, Antonio learned the officer had complimented his precision. The praise left him unsettled. Enemies weren't supposed to notice such things. Evenings were the strangest time. After dinner, which always included more food than Marco thought possible, the prisoners were left largely to themselves. Some gathered in small groups to talk quietly, voices low and uncertain. Others wrote letters home, though they didn't know when or if those letters would arrive. A few played cards with decks provided by the Red Cross. And then, one warm April evening, everything changed. An American sergeant appeared at the barracks door, clipboard in hand, and announced something in English. The translator, a nervous young Italian-American soldier named Dante, stepped forward. The sergeant says there are recreational facilities available. You can use them during free time. Gym, he says. Sports equipment. Silence greeted this announcement. Recreational facilities? Giovanni frowned. Like a church festival? Dante shook his head. Like a gymnasium. For exercise. Basketball, he thinks. Boxing, maybe. Marco exchanged glances with Antonio. This had to be a trick, some elaborate humiliation waiting to spring, yet curiosity gnawed at him. That night, unable to sleep, he lay awake thinking about the word gymnasium. In Italy, before the war, he'd sometimes watched boxing matches in town squares. He'd kicked a football with friends in dusty streets. Those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, someone younger and less broken. The next afternoon, a group of prisoners, Marco and Giovanni among them, followed Dante toward a long, low building at the camp's edge. The doors stood open, revealing polished wooden floors that gleamed under electric lights. Marco stepped inside cautiously, breath-catching. The space was vast. Basketball hoops hung at either end. Along one wall, a rack of weights sat beside leather punching bags that swayed slightly in the breeze from open windows. At the far end, a roped boxing ring waited, canvas stretched tight. Giovanni whispered something profane under his breath. Marco said nothing, too stunned to form words. An American soldier, young and grinning, gestured toward the basketball, pointed at the weights, made a punching motion. The invitation was unmistakable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Antonio, the quiet shopkeeper, walked slowly to the weights. He picked up a barbell, tested its heft, and set it down again. His face held an expression Marco couldn't name, something like grief mixed with wonder. Slowly, hesitantly, other men began to explore. Someone picked up a basketball, tossed it experimentally. It bounced with a satisfying thud. A young prisoner from Naples approached the punching bag, touched it with one finger, then struck it tentatively. The bag swung. He hit it again, harder. The rhythm built. Around the room, the sound of motion grew, shoes squeaking on polished floors, the thud of leather, breath coming faster. He had never boxed formally, but he'd fought as a boy, quick fists and scraped knuckles. The ring called to something buried deep, something that had survived Tunisia and the surrender and the long journey across the Atlantic. He climbed through the ropes, stood on the canvas, and felt, for the first time in months, almost human. Giovanni appeared at ringside, eyes wide. "You're going to fight?" Marco shook his head. "Just stand here. Remember what it feels like to choose something." Giovanni nodded slowly, understanding more than the words. Around them, the gym filled with the sounds of men rediscovering their bodies. Laughter, tentative at first, began to thread through the noise. Someone made a joke. Someone else responded. The ice of fear, so thick for so long, began to crack. That night, the barracks hummed with quiet conversations. Men who had barely spoken since capture now debated the merits of American basketball versus Italian football. Antonio demonstrated a weightlifting technique he'd learned from an American soldier. Giovanni practiced his English words, stumbling over pronunciation while others corrected him good-naturedly. Marco lay on his bunk, listening, and felt something shift inside him. Not trust, not yet, but the beginning of doubt. Doubt in the propaganda. Doubt in the certainties he'd carried. The gym became a fixture of daily life. Each evening after work and dinner, men drifted there as if pulled by invisible threads. Basketball games formed spontaneously, teams shouting encouragement in Italian and broken English. The weights saw steady use, prisoners building back muscle that hunger had stolen, and the boxing ring, that canvas square, became a strange sanctuary. Marco found himself there often. He'd lace up the gloves provided by the camp, step through the ropes, and spar with whoever volunteered. It was always controlled, always careful. No one wanted injury. But the movement, the focus required to dodge and strike, gave him something propaganda had never offered: purpose without ideology. Giovanni watched from the sidelines, cheering when Marco landed a clean hit, groaning when he took one. One evening, an American soldier, a stocky man with a crooked nose and calloused knuckles, climbed into the ring opposite Marco. Through gestures and Dante's halting translation, he challenged Marco to a friendly match. Marco hesitated. Fighting the enemy felt dangerous, even in this controlled space. But the soldier's grin was genuine, his stance that of someone who loved the sport, not the war. Marco nodded. They sparred for 3 rounds. The American was skilled, throwing punches with practiced precision. Marco countered as best he could. Defense learned in Florentine alleyways, holding up better than he'd expected. When the timer rang, they both stepped back, breathing hard. The American extended a gloved hand. Marco took it. Around the ring, prisoners and guards alike applauded. It was such a small moment. Just 2 men sweating in a gym. But it mattered more than Marco could articulate. Afterward, catching his breath, Marco sat on the ring apron. Giovanni handed him water. "You okay?" Marco nodded. "I don't understand this place." Giovanni sat beside him. "Me neither, but I'm not as afraid anymore." Marco considered this. Fear had been their constant companion since Tunisia. It had wrapped around them like chains, invisible but crushing. Now, in this strange Texas camp, with its food and its gym and its inexplicable kindness, that fear was loosening its grip. He didn't know if that was good or dangerous. He only knew he felt more alive than he had in a very long time. Spring turned toward summer. The Texas heat intensified, pressing down like a heavy hand. Work details moved slower, guards allowing more frequent water breaks. In the fields, Marco and his crew learned to move with the sun, working early mornings and late afternoons, resting during the brutal midday. The farmer who employed them, a weathered man named Samuel with sun-creased eyes, treated them with rough fairness. He demonstrated tasks clearly, corrected mistakes without malice, and once, when Marco stumbled in the heat, handed him a canteen without a word. These small mercies accumulated like coins in a jar, each one a tiny weight shifting the balance of Marco's understanding. The propaganda had promised brutality, reality delivered, competence and occasional kindness. It was disorienting. He found himself watching the Americans, trying to understand them. They laughed easily, these young soldiers. They complained about the food even though it was abundant. They wrote letters home, faces softening as they read responses. They were just men, not monsters, not saviors. Just men doing a job, far from wherever they called home. In the barracks one night, Antonio voiced what many felt. "They're winning us over." His tone carried accusation and resignation in equal measure. Giovanni frowned. "By feeding us? By not beating us? That's not winning, that's just being human." But Antonio shook his head. "It's a strategy. If we return to Italy thinking well of them, we spread that. We become their propaganda." Marco listened, turning the words over in his mind. Antonio wasn't wrong. There was strategy here, calculation behind kindness. Yet that didn't make the food less real, the gym less valuable, the absence of cruelty less profound. Maybe, he thought, both things could be true. The Americans could be pragmatic and decent simultaneously. War didn't erase humanity, even when it tried. Letters from home began arriving, passed through military censors and Red Cross channels. Marco received one from his mother, the paper thin and creased from its long journey. Her handwriting shook with emotion. She wrote of shortages, of Allied bombing raids, of neighbours who had lost sons. She asked if he was being treated well, her words careful, coded. Marco read it 3 times, each pass deepening the ache in his chest. He missed home with a fierceness that surprised him, yet he also felt a guilty gratitude that he was here, fed and safe, while Italy burned. Giovanni's letter brought worse news. His father's fishing boat had been destroyed in a raid. The family was surviving, but barely. Giovanni went silent after reading it, retreating into himself. Marco sat with him that evening, saying nothing because there were no words. After a long while, Giovanni spoke quietly. "At least I'm alive to know. At least I can go back and help rebuild." Marco nodded. Survival, it seemed, was its own complicated mercy. As the days lengthened and summer settled over the camp, the prisoners fell into something resembling normalcy. Routines that had once felt alien became familiar. The morning bell no longer startled. Work assignments were accepted without question. Evenings in the gym became anticipated highlights. And slowly, imperceptibly, the men began to change. Marco noticed it first in Giovanni's face. The gauntness softened as regular meals restored flesh to bone. His eyes, which had been flat with defeat, began to show flickers of humour again. He joked with the cooks, practiced English with stubborn determination, even started teaching an American guard basic Italian phrases. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was undeniable. Antonio remained more guarded, but even he couldn't entirely resist. Marco caught him once, helping an American soldier understand a complicated laundry stain. The two men worked together in companionable silence, problem-solving without language, connected by the simple satisfaction of a job well done. When they finished, the soldier clapped Antonio on the shoulder, grinning. Antonio almost smiled back. And Marco himself? He felt the change most acutely in the gym. Each time he stepped into that space, each time he wrapped his hands and entered the ring, he reclaimed a piece of himself that Tunisia had tried to bury. He was more than a defeated soldier, more than a prisoner. He was still Marco Bianchi, stonemason, brother, son. A man who could throw a punch, sink a basket, sweat under Texas stars, and feel his heart beat strong and steady. One evening, after a particularly satisfying sparring session, Marco stood outside the gym, cooling down in the twilight. Giovanni joined him, both men watching fireflies blink in the distance. Giovanni spoke first. "Do you think this changes us?" Marco considered. "I think it already has." Giovanni nodded. "When we go home, if we go home, will we tell them? About this? About how the enemy treated us?" Marco didn't answer immediately. The question was larger than it seemed. To speak well of the Americans would invite accusations of betrayal, of having been seduced by enemy propaganda. Yet to remain silent felt like lying. Finally, he said, "I think we tell the truth. However complicated that truth is." Giovanni exhaled slowly. "That's dangerous." Marco smiled without humour. "So is everything else." Summer peaked, and with it came news that filtered through the camp like smoke. Italy had surrendered. Mussolini had fallen. The war they'd been fighting had collapsed behind them. The announcement came through official channels, read in Italian and English to assembled prisoners. Silence followed, heavy and complete. For some, it meant relief. For others, shame. For many, confusion so profound it felt like drowning. That night, the barracks erupted into arguments. Some men wept, others raged. A few sat in stunned silence, unable to process what it meant. Marco found himself numb. Italy had surrendered. The country he'd been raised to believe invincible had admitted defeat. Everything he'd fought for, everything he'd endured, rendered meaningless in a bureaucratic announcement. Giovanni grabbed his arm, face pale. "What happens to us now?" The answer came within days. The Americans offered a choice. Italian prisoners could volunteer for the Italian service units, working alongside American forces in non-combat roles. They'd receive better pay, more freedom, and a faster path home eventually. Or they could remain prisoners, treated fairly under Geneva Convention rules, but with limited privileges. The decision, they were told, was theirs. Marco agonized over it. To volunteer felt like collaboration, a betrayal of something he couldn't quite name. Yet to refuse seemed pointless, clinging to loyalty for a government that had collapsed. He watched other men struggle with the same calculation. Antonio volunteered immediately, pragmatic as always. Giovanni hesitated longer, torn between pride and practicality, before finally signing up. In the end, Marco chose to volunteer, not from ideology, but from exhaustion. The war had taken enough. If the Americans wanted his labor in exchange for dignity and a path home, so be it. He signed the papers, received a new insignia marking him as part of the Italian service units, and felt nothing. Just a deep, bone-tired weariness. The months that followed blurred together. Work continued, now with slightly more freedom. Passes to nearby towns were granted occasionally, always supervised. Marco found himself in an American diner once, sitting at a counter, eating hamburgers that tasted of an entirely foreign world. The waitress smiled at him, called him honey, refilled his coffee without judgment. He paid with the scrip the army provided and left feeling dislocated, as if he'd stepped into someone else's dream. Giovanni thrived in this new role. He worked in supply depots, learned English rapidly, even made friends with some American soldiers. One, a young man from New York named Danny, taught him baseball. Marco watched them throw a ball back and forth one afternoon, laughing at miscommunications, and felt something like envy. Giovanni had found a way to live in this strange space between war and peace, between captivity and freedom. Marco still felt trapped between worlds, unable to fully commit to either. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Antonio, ever practical, saved his pay and spoke constantly of rebuilding. His shop in Milan was gone, destroyed in bombing, but he had plans. New stock, new location, leveraging connections from before the war. He treated the Italian service unit as a job, nothing more, executing tasks with professional competence and going home each night to dream of fabric and thread. As 1944 gave way to 1945, the world shifted again. News of Allied advances reached them. The invasion of France, the push into Germany, the slow, grinding collapse of the Axis. Marco received letters from his mother describing Italy under occupation, American and British forces everywhere, rebuilding already beginning. She asked when he'd come home. He didn't know. The gym remained his refuge. The routines there held steady even as everything else transformed. Weights lifted, basketballs bounced. The boxing ring welcomed anyone seeking that peculiar meditation of controlled violence. Marco sparred regularly now, his skills sharpened by practice and necessity. The American soldiers treated him differently after he joined the service units, less like a prisoner, more like a colleague. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt complicated. One spring evening in 1945, as news of Germany's surrender spread through the camp, Marco sat on the gym steps, watching sunset paint the Texas sky in impossible shades of orange and gold. Giovanni found him there. "It's really over." Marco nodded. "Yeah." They sat in silence, letting the enormity settle. The war that had defined their lives, that had shaped and shattered them, was done. They had survived. They had been captured, transported across an ocean, treated with a kindness they hadn't expected, and somehow remained themselves, mostly. "What happens now?" Giovanni asked eventually. Marco shrugged. "We go home, rebuild, try to remember how to be civilians." Giovanni laughed, the sound rough but genuine. "I forgot how to do that years ago." Marco smiled despite himself. "Then we learn again, together." The announcement came on a humid August morning, crackling through loudspeakers mounted on barracks walls. The war with Japan had ended. All of it. Every front, every battle. Finally, over. Marco stood in the yard with hundreds of other Italian service unit members, listening to the words repeat in English and Italian, and felt nothing register. He had expected relief, joy, something celebratory. Instead, there was only a hollow recognition that the world had shifted again, and he would have to shift with it. Within weeks, the camp began to dissolve. Men processed out in groups, paperwork signed, final paychecks distributed. Some chose to stay in America, taking up offers of immigration and citizenship. Others, the vast majority, wanted only to go home. Marco watched friends make impossible choices. Giovanni debated for days before deciding to return to Sicily, to his father's rebuilt fishing boat and the life waiting there. Antonio had never wavered. Milan called him with a voice louder than any American promise. Marco received his orders in late September. He would ship out from New York in October, joining thousands of other repatriated soldiers on converted troop transports. The night before departure, he walked through the camp one final time. The barracks stood empty, windows dark. The mess hall, once filled with the smell of coffee and conversation, was silent. He saved the gym for last. The doors were unlocked. Inside, the polished floor gleamed under a single overhead light. The basketball hoops cast long shadows. The weights sat in their rack, waiting for hands that wouldn't return. Marco walked to the boxing ring, ran his fingers along the ropes. How many hours had he spent here? How many rounds sparred? How much sweat left on this canvas? The ring had given him back something he'd lost in Tunisia, not innocence, that was gone forever, but a sense of agency. Here, he had been allowed to be strong without being cruel, competitive without being destructive. He climbed through the ropes one last time, stood at the center, and closed his eyes. In the darkness behind his lids, he could hear the phantom sounds, gloves striking leather, breath coming hard, Giovanni's voice calling encouragement from ringside. When he opened his eyes, the gym was silent again. He climbed out carefully, boots touching the polished floor for the final time. At the door, he turned back, memorizing the space. Then he left, pulling the door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like goodbye. The journey home began with trains cutting across America's heartland. Marco pressed his face to the window, watching landscapes slide past. Kansas wheat fields golden under autumn sun, the Mississippi River, vast and muscular, indifferent to the wars fought beyond its banks, towns he'd never see again, their names meaningless, but their existence somehow reassuring. The country that had held him captive was also the country that had fed him, sheltered him, given him a gym and a chance to remain human. He didn't know how to reconcile that. New York Harbor appeared through morning fog, the city rising like a dream made of steel and ambition. The Statue of Liberty stood as it had when he'd first seen it, but this time he understood it differently, not as enemy territory, but as a symbol of something he'd experienced firsthand, the idea that even in war, even between enemies, there could be dignity. He didn't know if he believed that absolutely, but he'd seen it proven in small ways, day after day, for 3 years. The ship was crowded, packed with Italian soldiers heading home to a country none of them fully recognized anymore. Marco found a spot on deck, leaning against the rail as New York receded. Giovanni stood nearby, quiet for once. Antonio was somewhere below, organizing his belongings with typical precision. The Atlantic stretched before them, grey and restless. Marco thought of the crossing in the opposite direction, how terrified he'd been, how certain of mistreatment. He thought of the food that first morning, the gym discovered by accident, the American soldier who'd sparred with him and then shaken his hand. The voyage took 2 weeks. Men played cards, told stories, wrote final letters to be mailed from Italy. Some spoke eagerly of reunions waiting, families intact and homes standing. Others remained silent, knowing they returned to devastation. Marco fell somewhere between. His mother's letters had been cautiously optimistic. The house stood. Food remained scarce but available. His younger sister had survived, but his brother, a soldier like Marco, had not returned. Lost somewhere on the Eastern Front, presumed dead but never confirmed. That loss sat like a stone in Marco's chest. They docked at Naples in late October of 1945. The city was a ruin. Buildings gutted by bombing stood like broken teeth against the sky. Rubble-lined streets where children played among the wreckage, their laughter eerily normal against the destruction. American and British soldiers were everywhere, directing traffic, distributing supplies, overseeing the massive project of reconstruction. Marco stepped onto Italian soil for the first time in 3 years and felt like a stranger in his own country. The processing station was chaos, organized by exhausted bureaucrats. Papers checked, identities confirmed, travel permits issued. Marco waited in lines that stretched for hours, watching other men reunite with family members who'd travelled to meet them. He saw tears, embraces, shocked silences as men confronted relatives ravaged by war. An older woman collapsed when she saw her son, joy and relief too much for her frail body. Medics rushed to help while the soldier knelt beside his mother, weeping. Giovanni found his father in the crowd, a weathered man who looked 10 years older than his age. They embraced without words, the fisherman's hands gripping his son's shoulders as if to verify he was real. Marco watched from a distance, feeling both happiness for his friend and a deep loneliness. His own mother was in Florence, days away by rail. He would make that journey alone. The train north moved slowly, stopping frequently for repairs or to clear tracks damaged by retreating German forces. Marco shared a compartment with other soldiers, all heading towards central Italy, all carrying the same exhausted silence. They spoke little, exhausted by years of holding themselves together. One man, younger than Marco, stared out the window with eyes that had seen too much. Another slept with his head against the glass, jerking awake at every stop as if expecting an attack. The landscape scrolling past was familiar yet transformed. Fields lay fallow, lacking the men to work them. Villages showed signs of occupation, painted signs in English and German, bullet holes pocking stone walls, makeshift graves marked with crude crosses. Yet life persisted. Women hung laundry, children chased chickens. Old men sat in doorways, watching trains pass with expressions that mixed curiosity and wariness. Italy had survived. Barely, but it had survived. Florence appeared through the train window like a mirage. The dome of the cathedral rose above the city, miraculously intact, a testament to either luck or divine intervention. But the surrounding buildings told a different story. Bombed bridges lay in the Arno River, twisted metal and broken stone. Entire neighborhoods reduced to rubble. American troops patrolled, but reconstruction was already underway. Trucks hauled debris, work crews cleared streets, and in the distance, the sound of hammers and saws spoke of rebuilding. Marco's mother lived in the Oltrarno, across the river, in an apartment that had somehow escaped major damage. He walked the last kilometers, his pack heavy on shoulders that had grown strong in Texas fields and gyms. The streets felt narrower than he remembered, the buildings closing in after years of Texas sky. He passed neighbors who stared at his uniform, some with recognition, others with the blank wariness of people who'd learned not to trust soldiers of any nationality. The apartment door was green, paint peeling. Marco stood before it, suddenly afraid. What if she didn't recognize him? What if he'd changed too much? He knocked, 3 sharp raps that echoed in the stairwell. Footsteps inside, slow and hesitant. The door opened. His mother stood there, smaller than he remembered, hair gone grey, face lined with years he'd missed. For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then she whispered his name like a prayer, and he stepped into her arms. They didn't speak at first, couldn't. His mother wept silently, hands patting his back, his arms, his face, as if confirming he was solid and real. Marco held her carefully, shocked by her fragility. When they finally separated, she pulled him inside, closing the door against the world. The apartment was sparse, furniture sold to buy food, but clean and ordered. She set him at the small kitchen table and began preparing coffee from precious reserves, hands shaking as she worked. The coffee was bitter and weak, but Marco drank it gratefully. His mother sat across from him, studying his face with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You look well," she said finally, and there was confusion in her tone. "America fed you?" Marco nodded. "They fed us, treated us fairly." Her eyes narrowed. The propaganda said otherwise. Marco met her gaze. The propaganda lied. About many things. Over the next hours, he told her some of what he'd experienced. Not everything, some stories felt too complicated to share, but enough. The food, the work, the gym. She listened without interrupting, occasionally shaking her head in disbelief. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Your brother wasn't so fortunate." The words hung heavy. Marco had known, but hearing it confirmed felt like a blow. His mother continued, voice steady despite the pain. "He was captured by the Russians. We received a notice. He died in a labor camp. Starvation, they said." The comparison sat between them, unspoken but massive. Two brothers, both captured. One was fed and given a boxing ring. One starved to death in the Siberian cold. The injustice of it, the arbitrary cruelty of fate, was overwhelming. Marco felt survivor's guilt crash over him like a wave. His mother reached across the table, took his hand. "You are here," she said firmly. "That is what matters. You lived. You came home. Do not waste that gift on guilt." The days that followed were spent relearning his city and his life. Marco registered with local authorities, a requirement for returning soldiers. He looked for work, but jobs were scarce and competition fierce. Thousands of men had returned, all needing employment, all competing for limited opportunities. He tried to find his old employer, the mason who'd taught him the trade, but the business had closed. The man had died in a bombing raid. He ran into Giovanni's father at the market one morning, the fisherman buying nets. The old man recognized him, shook his hand warmly. "Giovanni wrote," he said. "He told us you were friends in America, that you looked out for each other." Marco nodded, throat tight. "How is Giovanni?" The father's smile was sad. "Adjusting. The sea is different now. Mind, dangerous. But we're clearing it, day by day. We'll survive." Marco believed him. Fishermen were survivors by nature. Antonio appeared unexpectedly one December afternoon, knocking on the apartment door. He'd tracked Marco down through old connections, determined to reconnect. They embraced like the brothers' war had made them. Antonio looked better than in Texas, some vitality restored by being home. He'd found a small shop space, was rebuilding his business with American loans. "Marshall Plan money," he explained. "The same Americans who captured us are now helping us rebuild. There's irony in that. They walked through Florence together, two former prisoners navigating a shattered city. Antonio talked about business, plans, optimism. Marco mostly listened, envying his friend's certainty. At a cafe, they drank watered-down wine and talked about Texas. "Remember the gym?" Antonio asked, a rare smile crossing his face. "Remember how we couldn't believe it at first?" Marco nodded. "I still think about it, what it meant that they gave us that." Antonio's expression turned serious. "It meant they understood something we didn't. That men need more than food and shelter. They need dignity, purpose. The fascists never understood that." Winter settled over Florence, cold and damp. Marco found work eventually, joining a reconstruction crew clearing rubble and salvaging materials. The labor was hard, his body initially protesting, but it felt good to build instead of destroy. He worked alongside other veterans, men who'd fought on various fronts, all now united in the simple goal of rebuilding. They didn't talk much about the war. That wound was too fresh, too complicated. Instead, they focused on the work, on the satisfaction of clearing one street at a time. Evenings, he often sat with his mother, listening to the radio, news from the wider world, the Nuremberg trials, the beginning of the United Nations, tensions growing between former allies. Italy was trying to find its place in this new order, no longer an empire, barely a functioning nation. But slowly, painfully, it was healing. American aid poured in, democratic elections were organized. The chaos of immediate post-war was giving way to something like stability. One night, unable to sleep, Marco wandered Florence's streets. He passed the cathedral, its dome illuminated by moonlight, crossed a temporary bridge erected where the old one had stood, ended up in a small piazza where young people gathered, talking and laughing. He watched them from the shadows, these Italians who'd survived and were now living, and felt both connected to and distant from them. They didn't know what he knew. They hadn't been fed by their enemies, hadn't sparred with American soldiers, hadn't learned that propaganda could lie so completely. He thought about the gym often, not nostalgically, but analytically, trying to understand what it had represented. The Americans could have simply warehoused them, met minimum Geneva Convention requirements, and called it done. Instead, they'd invested in facilities, equipment, opportunities for prisoners to remain physically and mentally healthy. It had been strategic, yes. Healthy prisoners worked better, caused fewer problems, might even become advocates for American values when they returned home. But Marco suspected it was more than pure strategy. The Americans, he'd met the guards, the cooks, the soldiers who sparred with him, had genuinely seemed to believe in treating people decently. It wasn't universal, and there had been moments of tension and prejudice. But overall, the system had functioned with a kind of pragmatic humanity that fascism had never offered. That realization was both liberating and troubling. If even enemies could show such decency, what did that say about the ideology he'd been taught to defend? Spring came, and with it, hope. The rubble piles shrank, businesses reopened. The reconstruction crews Marco worked with made visible progress. He received a letter from Giovanni, full of news about Sicily, about the fishing, about a girl he'd met. Reading between the lines, Marco could tell his friend was healing, finding his way back to life. Antonio sent word that his shop was doing well, and would Marco like to visit Milan? Perhaps there was work there, better opportunities than Florence offered. Marco considered it but decided to stay. Florence was home, and he'd spent enough years as a transient. He found steady work with a reconstruction firm, specializing in salvaging and reusing old stone. His mason's training served him well, and the foreman recognized quality craftsmanship. The pay was modest but fair. He could support his mother and begin saving. Small steps toward a normal life. One July evening, walking home after work, he passed a building that had been converted into a community center. Through open windows, he heard sounds that stopped him cold. A basketball bouncing, voices calling in Italian, laughter. He moved closer, peering inside. Young men played on a makeshift court, the rim crooked but functional. In a corner, a punching bag hung from a beam, someone working it with determined focus. It wasn't the Texas gym, but it was close enough to make his chest tight. He stood there for a long time, watching. These young Italians, too young to have fought, were discovering what he'd learned in captivity. That sport could be sanctuary, that physical exertion could provide purpose, that competition could exist without killing. Eventually, someone noticed him staring. "Hey, you want to play?" The invitation was casual, friendly. Marco hesitated, then nodded. He stepped inside, introduced himself, and within minutes was passing the basketball, his body remembering the rhythms learned in Texas. The game was ragged but joyful. No one cared about skill level or mistakes. They played until exhausted, then collapsed on the floor, breathing hard and grinning. One young man asked Marco where he'd learned basketball. Marco paused before answering. "America. I was a prisoner there." Silence fell, curiosity sharpening every face. "Was it terrible?" someone asked. Marco considered his answer carefully. "No, it wasn't terrible. That's what surprised me." They wanted to hear more, these young men who'd lived through occupation but not combat. Marco found himself telling them about the gym, about the food, about American soldiers teaching him basketball rules. He didn't glorify it or exaggerate. He simply told the truth as he'd experienced it. When he finished, one young man said quietly, "I heard stories like that. My uncle was captured too. He said the Americans treated him better than our own officers did." Several others nodded agreement. Marco started returning to the community center regularly. He played basketball, helped maintain the equipment, even organized informal tournaments. It became another routine in his slowly normalizing life. Work during the day, basketball in the evening, time with his mother, letters to Giovanni and Antonio. The rhythms of peace, so strange after years of chaos. Years passed. 1946 became 1947, then 48. Italy stabilized, joined new European coalitions, began its economic miracle. Marco's reconstruction crew worked on increasingly ambitious projects. He saved money, eventually moved to a better apartment with his mother. She aged gracefully, her wartime steel softening into the grandmother she'd become to the neighborhood children. Giovanni visited once, in 1949, on his way to Rome for business. They spent an evening drinking wine and reminiscing. Giovanni had married his fishing village girl, had a son. His father's business was thriving. "You seem happy," Marco observed. Giovanni smiled. "I am." "You?" Marco considered. "I'm content." "That's more than I expected." Giovanni raised his glass. "To contentment. To survival." They drank to that. Antonio wrote less frequently as his business grew, but when he did, his letters were warm. He'd married as well, was building an empire of fabric shops across northern Italy. Once he sent Marco an expensive suit, perfectly tailored, with a note. "For the man who taught me that work done well is its own reward." Marco wore it rarely but treasured it. In 1952, a journalist tracking down former POWs for a magazine piece found Marco. Would he be willing to be interviewed about his experiences? Marco initially refused, uncomfortable with the attention. But the journalist was persistent, promising to handle the story with sensitivity. Eventually, Marco agreed. The interview took place in his apartment, his mother serving coffee while Marco spoke. He told his story honestly. The capture, the journey, the shock of American treatment, the gym that had saved him in ways he still struggled to articulate. The journalist took notes, asked thoughtful questions, and at the end said, "Your story matters. People need to know that even in war, humanity can survive." The article appeared months later. Marco's mother bought 3 copies, read it repeatedly, face soft with complicated emotions. Neighbors stopped him on the street, having read it, asking questions. Some veterans sought him out, wanting to share their own stories. Marco found himself part of an informal network of men who'd been prisoners in America, all wrestling with similar complicated gratitude. One evening at the community center, a young man asked Marco to teach him boxing. Marco hesitated, then agreed. They started with basics: stance, guard, footwork. The young man was clumsy but determined. Over weeks he improved, others joined. Soon Marco was running informal boxing classes, teaching the sweet science to kids who'd never known war. He found satisfaction in it, passing forward what he'd learned. Time continued its steady march. His mother died peacefully in her sleep in 1955, Marco at her bedside. He grieved her loss but took comfort in knowing she'd lived to see him rebuild his life. At her funeral, former POWs he'd connected with attended, standing with him in solidarity. They understood loss in ways others couldn't. Giovanni's letters mentioned grandchildren. Antonio's business expanded to France. Marco remained in Florence, working, teaching, boxing, living quietly. He never married, though there had been opportunities. Something in him had been changed too fundamentally by the war and its aftermath. He was content alone, surrounded by his routines and memories. In 1963, 20 years after his capture, Marco received an unexpected letter. It was from an American veteran who'd been a guard at the Texas camp. The man, now middle-aged and living in California, wrote that he'd read the magazine article and recognized Marco's name. "I remember you," the letter said. "You were the one who boxed with Sergeant Miller. I always wondered what happened to you guys after you went home. If you're ever in America, I'd be honored to meet you." Marco stared at the letter for a long time. He'd never considered returning to America, had assumed that chapter was permanently closed, but the invitation stirred something. He wrote back, politely thanking the veteran and saying perhaps someday. They began a correspondence that continued for years. Two former enemies become friends through letters that bridged continents and languages. In 1968, 25 years after the GWWII, Marco stood at a ceremony honoring Italian-American cooperation. He'd been invited as a representative of former POWs who'd experienced American captivity. The event was formal, politicians giving speeches about alliance and shared values. Marco stood quietly at the edge, uncomfortable with the attention, but recognizing the symbolism. Afterward, a young Italian-American soldier approached him. "My grandfather was a guard in a POW camp in Texas," the soldier said. "He always spoke highly of you guys. Said you worked hard, played harder, treated each other with respect." Marco felt emotion tighten his throat. "Thank you for telling me." The soldier smiled. "He's here, actually. Would you like to meet him?" The old guard was there, aged but recognizable. They shook hands, two old men connected by a strange chapter of history. "We did our best," the guard said simply. "Tried to treat you all like we'd want to be treated." Marco nodded. "You succeeded. More than you know." They talked for an hour, sharing perspectives on events experienced from opposite sides of the fence. When they parted, both felt something settle, some unfinished business finally completed. Marco returned to Florence and to his life. He continued teaching boxing to neighborhood kids, continued working construction, continued writing to Giovanni and Antonio and the American veteran in California. His days were full, if not exciting. He had survived war, captivity, and reconstruction. He had learned that enemies could be human, that propaganda could be shattered, that small kindnesses mattered more than grand gestures. The gym in Texas was long gone, likely demolished or converted to other use, but its impact remained, carried in the bodies and minds of men who'd found dignity in a boxing ring, purpose in a basketball game, humanity in the space between enemies. Marco had tried to pass that forward, teaching his young boxers not just technique but something more, that strength didn't require cruelty, that competition could exist without hatred, that a man could fight for himself without fighting against everyone else. On quiet evenings, sitting in his apartment with a book and weak wine, Marco sometimes closed his eyes and heard phantom sounds. Basketballs bouncing on polished wood, gloves striking leather, Giovanni's voice calling encouragement, the bell ending another round. Those sounds had saved him when he'd needed saving most, and in teaching others to box, in helping rebuild Florence one stone at a time, in living with decency and modest ambition, he honored the unexpected gift that captivity had given him. Italy had rebuilt itself into something new, a democracy struggling but surviving. Marco had rebuilt himself similarly. He was no longer the frightened young soldier who'd surrendered in Tunisia, nor the confused prisoner who'd first seen the gym. He was simply Marco Bianchi, a man who'd lived through extraordinary times and chosen, every day, to remain decent. That choice, repeated across thousands of lives like his, had helped create the peaceful, prosperous Europe his grandchildren's generation would inherit. The war had taken much his brother, his youth, his certainties, but in the strange alchemy of capture and captivity, it had also given him something. The knowledge that even in humanity's darkest moments, small lights could persist, a meal freely given, a gym door left open, a sparring match between enemies who, for 3 rounds, were just two men testing themselves against each other with mutual respect. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.